The air in Scriptorium 7 was a perfect, sterile null. It carried no dust, no microbes, no scent. It was the architectural embodiment of purity, a crystalline cage designed for the preservation of its single, priceless occupant. Scribe 734, Elian, a name he kept folded away in the quietest recess of his mind like a forbidden text, drew that clean air into his lungs and felt nothing. It was the feeling he had known for all of his 22 cycles of existence, a placid, orderly void. His fingers, long and pale, hovered over the luminous surface of the data slate, its cool light bathing his face in an impersonal blue. He was transcribing the logistical annals of the outer sector pacification campaigns, a litany of numbers and strategic deployments that flowed through him without friction, without meaning. He was a conduit, a vessel. He was not a person. He was an asset. The door to the scriptorium slid open with a sigh of pressurized air, a sound so precise it was more a part of the silence than a break in it. Elian did not look up. Protocol forbade it. His focus was the data stream, the endless river of information he was tasked to channel into the Crown's eternal archives. A presence entered the room. It did not disturb the perfect air, yet it altered the very density of the space. It was a weight, a gravity that pulled at the edges of Elian's concentration. He felt the subtle shift in air currents as the presence moved to the designated observation post at the far wall, a shadow falling into place behind the polarized glass. He knew, without seeing, who it was. The reports had preceded him. Commander Kalen, first knight of the Sovereign Guard, his new protector, or his new warden. The distinction was semantic. Elian's focus wavered. A single glyph flickered, a corruption in the data stream of his own making. He corrected it instantly, his fingers moving with practiced speed, but the error was a tremor through the placid surface of his composure. He had never made such an error before. His function was precision. He felt the gaze from behind the glass, a palpable, analytical weight. It was not the passive surveillance of the automated sentinels or the infrequent, detached inspections from the curators. This was different. This was a focused, living intelligence, and it was dissecting him. The tiny hairs on his arms, relics of a biology long suppressed by systemic inhibitors, seemed to stir. A phantom sensation, an impossibility. He forced the feeling down, bearing it under layers of protocol and training. He was Scribe 734. His internal state was irrelevant. Only the data mattered. He continued his work for 3 standard hours. The presence remained, unmoving, unwavering, a monolith of pure discipline. Elian could almost map its form in the negative space of the room's sensory data, the faint thermal signature, the minute displacement of air, the absolute cessation of random sound. It was a control so absolute it was a form of violence against the natural chaos of existence. Finally, the soft chime of the cycle end protocol echoed through the scriptorium. Elian lifted his fingers from the slate, the blue light extinguishing, plunging the room into a soft, pearlescent twilight from the ambient ceiling panels. He stood, his movements fluid and economical, and turned to face the observation post. As he did, the polarized glass clarified, dissolving the barrier between them. And he saw him. Commander Kalen was exactly as the official records described him, yet the data failed to capture the sheer, oppressive reality of him. He was tall, built with the stark, functional lethality of a weapon. His uniform was the color of a starless night, broken only by the silver insignia of his rank on his collar. His face was a study in harsh planes and severe angles, his expression a mask of dispassionate neutrality. But it was his eyes that held Elian captive. They were the color of storm-darkened ice, and they saw not a person, but a strategic component, a variable to be managed. There was no cruelty in them. There was no kindness. There was only duty, an abyss of it. Scribe 734, Kalen's voice was a low baritone, as devoid of inflection as the air between them. Your security protocols have been elevated. I am your designated guardian. I am aware, Commander, Elian replied, his own voice a carefully modulated tenor. He kept his gaze fixed on the insignia at Kalen's throat as protocol dictated. Direct eye contact with an alpha of Kalen's rank was an act of insubordination. I will not impede your duties. You will not have the opportunity, Kalen stated. It was not a threat. It was a fact. Your work is vital to the crown. Your integrity will be maintained at any cost. The word integrity hung in the air, clinical and cold. It meant his physical safety, his psychological stability, the continued function of the inhibitor implant at the base of his skull that kept his Omega biology a dormant, theoretical concept. It meant he would continue to be a perfect, sterile vessel. Kalen's gaze swept over him, a dispassionate inventory. Elian felt it like a scan, cataloguing his posture, his breathing, the steady metronomic beat of his heart. He felt an irrational urge to flinch, to hide, to do anything that would disrupt the cold assessment. He did not. He stood perfectly still, a statue of compliance. Your vital signs are stable. Your output is within acceptable parameters, despite a minor anomaly at 14:32 Standard Time, Kalen continued, his voice unwavering. The error. He had noted the error. Of course he had. See that it does not repeat. Yes, Commander. You will be escorted to your quarters. You will remain there until the next work cycle. These are your new standing orders. Kalen turned, his movements as precise as the door sliding open at his approach. He did not look back. He did not need to. His authority filled the room, a lingering pressure wave. Elian followed, his steps silent on the polished floor, 2 meters behind the commander, as protocol dictated. He walked in the shadow of the man who served only the crown, a man whose existence was a testament to the system that owned them both. And as he breathed in the clean, empty air for the first time in his life, Elian felt the suffocating weight of its perfection. He felt the bars of his crystalline cage, and for a reason he could not comprehend, he felt the first terrifying impulse to push against them. The impulse was a flicker, a single corrupted glyph in the code of his being. He corrected it, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the sterile air, that the error had been saved. Commander Kalen observed the asset. Scribe 734, the designation felt more accurate than the name, Elian, which he had reviewed in the assets file and promptly discarded as irrelevant data, was a model of systemic conditioning. His movements were efficient, his posture deferential, his vocalizations precise and devoid of emotional color. He was the pinnacle of the scribe program, a living archive of immense value, and like any priceless artifact, he was fragile. Kalen's new assignment was a reflection of that value. The recent intelligence chatter about dissident factions targeting high-value crown assets had prompted the Regent Council to upgrade security, and there was no higher security than the first night. From his post behind the observation glass, Kalen monitored the scribe's workflow. The flicker of the glyph on the data slate at 14:32 was a deviation so minor It would have been missed by any standard monitoring system. But Kalen was not a standard system. His senses, his perception, had been honed by decades of training and augmentation to detect the subtlest shifts in pattern, the faintest tremors of instability. He logged the anomaly, a potential precursor to cognitive degradation, a sign of neurofatigue. He would recommend the curators run a full diagnostic. The asset's function could not be compromised. It was a matter of state security. He dismissed the polarized shield and confronted the scribe directly. The boy, and he was a boy, despite his chronological age, was pale and slender, with wide, dark eyes that he dutifully kept averted. There was a fineness to his features that seemed ill-suited to the stark functionality of the citadel. He looked like something that belonged in an ancient art exhibit, a porcelain figure preserved under glass. And that was precisely what he was. Kalen felt the familiar, cold weight of his duty settle over him. Protect the asset, preserve the system, uphold the crown. The words were the bedrock of his consciousness, the load-bearing walls of his soul. As he escorted the scribe to his residential module, Kalen maintained the regulation 2-meter distance. The corridors of the citadel were vast and white, silent save for the low hum of the environmental systems and the rhythmic tap of his own mag-soled boots on the composite flooring. The scribe was utterly silent, a ghost gliding in his wake. Yet Kalen detected something, a flicker, a scent. It was impossible. The air in the citadel was scrubbed to the molecular level. Every individual, particularly high-value assets like the scribe, was fitted with scent neutralizers and hormonal inhibitors that rendered them biologically inert. And yet, it was there, a trace element in the recycled air, so faint it was less a smell and more the ghost of a memory of one. It was subtle, like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike on barren rock, or the hint of rain on dry earth. It was clean, yet unsettlingly organic. He ran a silent diagnostic through his neural interface. Air quality, 100% purity. Scribe 734's biodata, all inhibitors functioning at peak efficiency. No anomalies detected. Kalen dismissed the sensory input as a synaptic misfire, a ghost in his own machine. His olfactory senses were augmented for tracking chemical signatures and explosives, not for perceiving phantom biological traces. It was a distraction. He purged the thought. They arrived at the scribe's quarters. The door slid open to reveal a room identical in its sterile minimalism to the scriptorium, differing only in the presence of a narrow sleep couch and a nutrient dispenser. It was a space for maintenance, not for living. "Your cycle ends here," Kalen said, his voice flat. He stood in the doorway, a sentinel barring the way to the world outside. "The module will remain sealed until 06 Gao. Your nutrient ration has been authorized." The scribe paused at the threshold, his back to Kalen. For a moment, he did not move. The stillness was a deviation from the expected pattern of immediate compliance. It lasted only a second, a beat of suspended time, but Kalen registered it. Then the scribe inclined his head in a shallow nod. "Understood, Commander." He entered the room without looking back. The door slid shut, sealing him inside. A soft click indicated the magnetic lock had engaged. Kalen remained for a full minute, his senses extended, listening. He heard the faint rustle of the scribe's uniform, the soft sigh of him sitting on the sleep couch. He heard the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing. The asset was secure. The asset was contained. He turned and walked away, his steps echoing in the empty hall. But the phantom scent lingered in his mind, a piece of data that did not fit the established parameters. He catalogued it, filed it away under unverified anomaly, and resolved to increase his surveillance. The integrity of the asset was his sole concern. He was a shield for the crown. He was a wall against chaos. He felt no connection to the boy in the white room. He felt no pity for his gilded cage. He felt nothing but the cold, clean certainty of his purpose. He served the crown. It was all he was. It was all he needed to be. Any other feelings was a system error. A far ghost, and he had been trained since birth to purge ghosts from the machine. The malfunction began not as a sound, but as a silence, a missing beat in the low, pervasive hum of the scriptorium's life support. For a microsecond, the universe held its breath. Elian's fingers froze over the data slate. The light from the ceiling panels flickered, a convulsive blink that plunged the room into a half-second of absolute darkness, before flaring back to its sterile, white glare. In that moment of manufactured night, something deep inside him shifted. A lock, rusted shut for a lifetime, gave way with a silent, seismic groan. Then the hum returned, but it was different. It was sharper, a higher frequency that scraped against his auditory nerves. The air, once a perfect null, suddenly tasted of ozone and hot metal. A wave of vertigo washed over him. The glyphs on the slate blurred, swimming in his vision like black fish in a pale blue sea. He pressed his palms against the cool surface, trying to anchor himself, but the world was tilting on its axis. A high-pitched whine started at the base of his skull, the location of the inhibitor implant. It was a hornet's buzz of angry energy, growing in intensity until it consumed all other sound. He felt it then, a flood, a tidal wave of sensory information crashing through the broken dam of his conditioning. For 22 years, he had lived in a world of muted grays, of filtered air and regulated sound. Now, color exploded behind his eyes. He could smell the subtle tang of the rare metals woven into the walls, the faint, clean scent of the nutrient paste he'd had for his morning ration, the ghost of an antiseptic cleansing agent used by a maintenance drone hours ago. It was too much. It was an agony of perception, and through it all, one scent cut through the chaos, a signal piercing the static. It was coming from the observation post. It was the scent of the commander. Before, Kalen had been a void, a presence defined by an absence of sensory data. Now, his scent filled the scriptorium. It was sharp and cold, like mountain air and winter steel, but beneath it, there was something else, something warmer, darker, the scent of wood smoke and storm-charged earth. It was a scent of absolute, unshakable authority, the scent of an alpha. Elian's body reacted before his mind could comprehend. A shudder racked his frame, a deep, primal tremor that had no place in his disciplined existence. His knees buckled. The whine in his skull crescendoed into a shriek of white-hot pain, and his vision dissolved into a starburst of static. He was falling. The polished floor rushed up to meet him. The polarized glass of the observation post vanished. Kalen moved with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. One moment he was a statue behind the glass. The next he was crossing the room, his long strides eating the distance. The alarms began to blare, a strident, panicked klaxon that signaled a critical asset failure. Red lights pulsed against the white walls, bathing the scene in a bloody, rhythmic strobe. Scribe 734. Kalen's voice cut through the noise, a blade of pure command. Elian didn't hear the words. He only felt the impact as Kalen caught him, preventing his head from striking the floor. Strong arms wrapped around his torso, pulling him back from the brink of unconsciousness. The contact was a cataclysm. Through the thin fabric of his uniform, Elian felt the solid heat of Kalen's body, the unyielding strength in his grip. It was the first time in his memory that he had been touched by another human being with anything other than the detached clinical efficiency of a curator. This was not clinical. This was grounding. This was real. A gasp tore from Elian's throat, raw and involuntary. His own scent, the one he never knew he possessed, bloomed in the air around them, triggered by the pain and the shock and the proximity of the alpha. It was a scent of rain-soaked parchment and a faint, fragile hint of something floral, like a night-blooming jasmine crushed underfoot. It was a scent of pure, terrified Omega. Kalen stiffened. Elian felt the shift in him, the sudden tension in the muscles of his arms. Through the haze of pain, Elian looked up, his gaze finally meeting the commander's. The storm-dark ice of Kalen's eyes was shattered. For a fleeting instant, the mask of dispassionate control was gone, and beneath it was something Elian could not name. It was shock, it was confusion, and it was something else, something deeper, a flicker of ancient predatory recognition. His pupils were dilated, the black swallowing the grey. The disciplined void of his scent was fractured, and the raw, potent aroma of the alpha, that scent of steel and smoke and storm, intensified, coiling in the air around them. The moment stretched, a lifetime in a handful of seconds. There was the wail of the alarms, the pulsing red light, the scent of alpha and omega mingling in the sterile air, a volatile, forbidden chemistry. Kalen held him, his grip like iron. He was not a guardian holding an asset. He was an alpha holding an omega. The realization struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. He was not just a scribe. He was not just a vessel. He was something else, something the crown had tried to erase. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slammed back into place. Kalen's eyes cleared, the ice reforming. He broke contact, carefully lowering Elian to the floor and rising to his full height. He tapped a command into his wristcom. The alarms ceased. The red lights died, leaving the stark white in their wake. The silence that descended was heavier, more profound than before. Medical team to Scriptorium 7. Kalen's voice was clipped, perfectly controlled, betraying none of the chaos of the preceding moments. Asset is unresponsive. Expedite. He looked down at Elian, his expression unreadable. You are malfunctioning, stated, his voice the cold, clinical tone of a diagnostician. But the air still tasted of ozone and storm, and Elian knew that something irreparable had been broken. Not just his inhibitor, but the very foundation of their world. The clean, orderly void had been breached, and chaos had been invited in. The recalibration was a violation. Elian was strapped to a cold metal table in the med bay, his consciousness submerged in a chemically induced twilight. He was aware of the curators moving around him, their voices muffled and distant. He felt the sting of needles, the cold touch of diagnostic probes on his skin. They were inside his head, their machines interfacing with his implant, forcing the broken code back into alignment. They were scrubbing the sensory data, erasing the memory of scent and touch, reimposing the sterile null. They were trying to put the ghost back in the bottle, but the ghost remembered. When he awoke, he was back in his residential module. The air was clean, the light was soft, The silence was absolute. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. The world looked the same, but he knew it was a facade. He knew that beneath the sterile white surfaces there was a universe of sensation he was being denied. The memory of Kalen's scent was a phantom limb, an ache for something he couldn't have. The memory of his touch was a brand on his skin. He was Scribe 734, an asset of the crown, but he was also Elian, an Omega who had been touched by an Alpha. The two identities were at war within him. His work continued. He sat before the data slate, his fingers transcribing the annals of the crown. His output was flawless. The anomaly was not repeated. To any observer, he was perfectly restored, the machine repaired. Commander Kalen stood his post at the observation window, a silent, unmoving sentinel. He never spoke of the incident. He never acknowledged the moment the universe had cracked open between them. His control was absolute. But Elian could feel his eyes on him, a constant, probing wait. The commander was watching him, waiting for the next fracture. In the prescribed hours of rest, when he was sealed within his white box, Elian began his own rebellion. It was a quiet, desperate insurgency. He used his innate connection to the data stream, the very thing that made him a scribe, to search for answers. He wove his consciousness into the archives, slipping past low-level security protocols like a whisper of smoke. He searched for forbidden words. Omega, Alpha, heat, scent, bond. The terms were heavily redacted, classified under archaic biology and societal deviancy protocols. Most files were locked behind firewalls he could not possibly breach, but he found fragments, scraps of information from pre-crown eras, medical texts describing a biology that was vibrant, powerful, and dangerous. Historical accounts of a society built around these dynamics, a world of instinct and emotion that the crown had deemed chaotic and impure, a world they had systematically dismantled and erased. He learned that what he had experienced was the catastrophic failure of a hormonal inhibitor during a nascent preheat. He learned that his scent was a biological signal, designed to attract and communicate. He learned that the overwhelming response he'd felt to the commander was not a malfunction, but a function, a design, an instinct as old as their species. He was not broken. He was waking up. His obsession grew, and it began to center on one man, Commander Kalen. He searched the personnel files, the military records. He learned of Kalen's origins, a product of the eugenics program bred for strength, loyalty, and discipline. He had graduated from the Alpha Academy at the top of his class. His record was a litany of perfect scores, successful missions, and unwavering devotion to the crown. There was not a single demerit, not a single mark of insubordination. He was the system's perfect soldier, a man sculpted from the bedrock of ideology. But Elian had seen the crack in the marble. He had seen the flicker of the beast behind the man's eyes. He had smelled the storm. The more he learned about the commander's perfect control, the more he fixated on the memory of that one moment of its absence. He replayed it in his mind, dissecting every detail. The dilation of Kalen's pupils, the sudden tension in his arms, the way his scent had flooded the room, a raw, possessive claim. It was a contradiction that fascinated and terrified him. How could a man so disciplined, so conditioned, possess such a wild thing inside him? His secret research was a dangerous game. If he were caught, the consequences would be more than recalibration. It would be decommissioning, sanitization. Yet he could not stop. The taste of knowledge, like the taste of sensation, was addictive. It was the first thing he had ever chosen for himself, the first secret he had ever kept. It was his. One cycle, as he was being escorted back to his quarters, the silence between them felt different. It was not empty. It was charged, filled with unspoken things. As they approached his door, Elian risked a glance up at the commander. Kalen was not looking at him, but staring straight ahead down the white corridor. Yet, Elian saw a muscle twitch in his jaw, a minute tightening of the skin around his eyes. He was aware of Elian's gaze. He was aware of him in a way that went beyond the protocols of a guardian and his charge. The door slid open. Elian stepped inside, but this time he turned before it could close. He looked at Kalen, holding his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was permissible. A challenge, a question. "Commander," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Kalen's eyes, cold and grey as a winter sea, met his. "Scribe," he acknowledged, his tone clipped. "Thank you," Elian said, "for the assistance during my malfunction." It was a breach of protocol to refer to the incident. It was a breach to express a personal sentiment. It was a test. Kalen's expression did not change. The mask was perfect. But Elian saw it. A flicker of something in the depths of his eyes. A recognition of the words beneath the words. The air between them grew thick, heavy. The phantom scent of ozone and parchment seemed to tremble in the space. "My duty is to ensure your functional integrity," Kalen replied, his voice a low, hard rumble. "There is no need for gratitude. There is only the execution of my function." He turned away. "Do not deviate from protocol again." The door slid shut, the lock clicking into place. Elian stood in the center of his white room, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was not a denial. It was a warning from a man who was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the enemies of the crown, and another, far more desperate battle against himself. And Elian knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was the battleground. Kalen stood outside the scribe's module long after the lock had engaged. He replayed the exchange. The boy's gaze, the quiet, deliberate breach of protocol. "Thank you." The words were a subtle poison, seeping into the cracks of his conditioning. Gratitude was an emotional response. It implied a personal debt. It was a variable he could not quantify, a threat he could not neutralize. And the way the scribe had looked at him, it was not the deferential gaze of an asset. It was the knowing look of an equal, an accomplice. He had felt it again. The scent, that impossible organic trace that his own systems insisted did not exist. When the boy spoke, it had ghosted into the air, the smell of old paper and rain. It clung to his uniform, a stain on the sterile perfection of his world. He had spent the weeks since the incident doubling his own discipline regimens, spending hours in the sensory deprivation chambers, purging his mind of the memory of that moment in the scriptorium, the memory of the boy's scent unfurling, of the raw biological command it had issued to the deepest, most ancient part of his alpha brain, the memory of his own response, the surge of possessive instinct that had, for one terrifying second, completely eclipsed his duty. He was compromised. The realization was a shard of ice in his gut. His proximity to the asset was a continuous, low-grade contamination. He saw the changes in the scribe. The boy was still compliant, his work still perfect. But there was a new stillness in him, a watchfulness. When he thought he was unobserved, Kalen had seen him through the scriptorium's micro-sensors, his eyes unfocused, his mind clearly somewhere other than the data stream. He was hiding something. Kalen had run deep-level surveillance on the scribe's data access. The boy was clever. He had left no obvious tracks, but there were faint ripples in the archives, the ghost trails of a mind searching for something it was not meant to find. The Regent Council had been pleased with the asset's swift recalibration. They considered the matter closed, but Kalen knew it was not. A crack had been exposed, not just in the scribe, but in the system itself. The inhibitors were not infallible. The conditioning could be broken. And what lay beneath was a chaos the Crown had spent centuries trying to exterminate. He should have reported his own compromised response. He should have submitted himself for psychological purgation. Protocol demanded it. Loyalty demanded it. But he had not. The omission was a treason of its own, a small, silent betrayal that festered in the quiet of his mind. Why? He analyzed the question with cold, brutal logic. Reporting the incident would cast doubt on his own integrity, his fitness as First Knight. That was a logical reason, but it was not the true one. The truth was, he did not want to forget. He did not want to have the memory of that scent, of that raw biological truth scrubbed from his mind. The thought was a heresy of the highest order. It was a flaw in his own code, a corruption far more dangerous than the scribe's. His duty became a form of penance. He increased his vigilance, his presence a constant, oppressive weight on the scribe's existence. He monitored his every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of an eyelid. The enforced proximity was a torment. Every time he entered the scriptorium, he had to consciously brace himself, building his mental walls higher, reinforcing the cage around the beast inside him. The boy's faint, clean scent was a constant test of his control, a whisper of temptation in the sterile silence. He was walking a razor's edge, and the abyss on either side was a fall from which he would not recover. One cycle, a new directive came down from the council. A dignitary from a newly annexed sector was being given a tour of the Citadel's core facilities, a display of the Crown's power and perfection. The tour would include a viewing of Scriptorium 7. The scribe was to be put on display, a living testament to the Crown's ability to refine and perfect nature itself. Kalen's orders were explicit. Ensure the asset presents a flawless image. No deviations, no anomalies. The dignitary was a coarse, brutish alpha from a culture the Crown was still civilizing. He stood before the observation glass, his bulk and gaudy finery an offense to the Citadel's clean lines. His scent was aggressively potent, a mix of musk and spice that the air scrubbers struggled to contain. He stared at Elian, who was working at his slate with a look of undisguised avarice. A remarkable specimen, the dignitary rumbled, his voice oily. So placid, so compliant. Our Omegas are far more spirited. It can be troublesome. The Crown values order, Kalen replied, his voice colder than the space between stars. He stood at parade rest, his gaze fixed forward, but every fiber of his being was focused on the man beside him, on the scribe behind the glass. Indeed, the dignitary chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. We have much to learn. Tell me, Commander, is it true that their natural impulses are completely erased? That there is nothing left of the original creature? The question was a deliberate provocation, a test. Kalen felt the beast stir in its cage, a low growl of territorial fury. The dignitary was looking at Elian not as an asset, but as property, as prey. "The asset is a functional component of the state," Kalen said, his words clipped and precise. "Its biological history is irrelevant." "A pity," the dignitary murmured, his eyes still fixed on Elian. "Such a delicate creation. It seems a waste." Kalen did not reply. He sent a silent, encrypted command through his neural link. Far down the corridor, a minor power conduit overloaded, triggering a low-level security alert in that sector. An aide appeared at the dignitary's elbow, whispering urgently. The tour was cut short. The dignitary was led away, casting one last, lingering look at the scriptorium. Kalen remained, his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles were white. He had manufactured a threat to neutralize another. He had manipulated Crown resources to remove a perceived sexual rival. The thought was insane, illogical. He was the first knight. He was a bastion of order. And he had just acted like a feral alpha, protecting a potential mate. He looked through the glass at Elian, who remained oblivious, his fingers moving gracefully over the slate. The boy was a catalyst, a chemical agent, introduced into a stable system, causing it to break down into its volatile components. The integrity of the asset was his mission, but he was beginning to realize, with a cold, dawning horror, that to protect Elian from the world, he might first have to protect him from himself, and that was a battle he was not certain he could win. The second failure was not a flicker. It was an implosion. It came without the warning of a power surge or a stutter in the system. It came from within, a biological imperative that overwhelmed the technology designed to suppress it. Elian was halfway through transcribing a census of Sector Gamma when a slow, syrupy heat began to pool in his lower abdomen. At first, it was a gentle warmth, a pleasant novelty in the climate-controlled chill of the scriptorium. But the warmth grew, spreading through his veins like molten honey, thick and intoxicating. His thoughts, usually so clear and linear, became clouded, hazy. The glyphs on the data slate began to lose their meaning, the sharp edges of the characters softening into abstract shapes. A strange languor settled over him. His body felt heavy, pliant. A deep resonant ache started in his bones, a longing for something he could not name. Pressure, touch, a presence. The sterile air of the scriptorium, once a neutral void, became an irritant. It was too thin, too empty. It lacked substance. It lacked him, the commander. Kalen's image bloomed in his mind, vivid and overwhelming. The memory of his scent of storm and steel was so powerful Elian could almost taste it. His own body, in turn, began to answer a call he had never known it could hear. The inhibitor implant at the base of his skull sent a frantic, useless cascade of error messages into his neural pathways. It was fighting a losing battle. His true biology, awakened and now resurgent, was simply shrugging off the shackles of the machine. The scent glands along his neck and wrists, dormant for his entire life, came alive. A fragrance, rich and complex, began to perfume the air. The faint, clean scent of parchment and rain was now deepened, sweetened, infused with a desperate, heady note of blooming night flowers and sweet musk. It was the scent of an omega in full, unexpected heat, an undeniable biological broadcast of need and invitation. The scriptorium's environmental sensors, calibrated for absolute purity, registered the organic compound as a catastrophic contamination. Alarms, different from before, began to sound. Not the loud klaxon of a mechanical failure, but a series of sharp, chilling chimes that echoed through the Citadel's command network. It was a biocontamination alert, a purity breach. Behind the observation glass, Kalen went rigid. He had smelled it a fraction of a second before the alarms confirmed it. The scent hit him not like a wave, but like a physical blow to the chest. It bypassed his conscious mind, his years of training, his iron-willed discipline, and struck directly at the core of his alpha genetics. Every instinct, every primal urge he had been conditioned to suppress, roared to life. The beast in the cage did not just stir, it shattered the bars. His vision narrowed, his hearing sharpened. The only thing that existed in the universe was the source of that scent. The Omega. His Omega, Elian cried out, a soft, keening sound of confusion and distress. He slid from his chair, curling on the floor as a wave of heat and cramping pain washed over him. The world was a blur of sensation, his own scent thick in his nostrils, a dizzying perfume of utter vulnerability. He was exposed, he was raw, and he was terrified. The door to the scriptorium slid open. Kalen stood there, a silhouette against the harsh white light of the corridor. The mask of the stoic commander was gone, utterly annihilated. His face was stark, his eyes burning with an intensity that was terrifying and magnetic. His pupils were blown wide, black pits of primal focus. The air around him crackled with a palpable energy, and his own scent, no longer disciplined and restrained, poured into the room. It was the unrestrained scent of a dominant alpha, a possessive, territorial aroma of wood smoke, ozone, and dark earth. It was a scent that promised both danger and protection, a scent that answered the desperate call of Elian's own. Through his wristcom, Kalen heard the clipped, impersonal voice of Citadel Control. Commander, Laofado, Class 1 Purity Breach has been declared in Scriptorium 7. The asset is designated defective. A purge and sanitization team has been dispatched. Your orders are to secure the perimeter and await their arrival. Do you copy, Commander? A purge team. Sanitization. The words were sterile euphemisms. Kalen knew what they meant. Decommissioning, incineration, the complete eradication of the contaminated asset to prevent any further breach of the Crown's genetic purity. They were coming to kill him, to destroy Elian. Kalen looked at the boy on the floor, shuddering and lost in the throes of a biological reality he couldn't understand. He saw not a defective asset. He saw not a contamination. He saw Elian. He saw the fragile, defiant life that had taken root in the sterile desert of his own existence. He heard the order from control. Secure the perimeter. Await the team. Obey. He had lived his entire life by a single, unwavering creed. I serve only the Crown. The words echoed in his mind, the cornerstone of his identity. He raised his hand to his comm, his finger hovering over the acknowledgement stud. He looked at Elian, whose wide, frightened eyes were fixed on him, a silent plea in their dark depths. The scent of Omega in distress was a physical agony, a command that superseded any order issued by a distant, faceless council. The purge team was 5 minutes away. 5 minutes until they destroyed the only thing in his meaningless life that had ever felt real. The creed fractured. The cornerstone of his soul crumbled to dust. I serve only the Crown. The words were a lie, a hollow, meaningless lie. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kalen lowered his hand. He did not acknowledge the order. Instead, he reached to the control panel by the door and slammed his palm against the emergency lockdown plate. A heavy Durasteel blast door crashed down, sealing the scriptorium from the outside world. Another command into his wrist unit cut all internal surveillance feeds, plunging them into an electronic black hole. The chimes of the bio-alarm were silenced, cut off at the source. They were alone, trapped. The air was thick with their mingled scents, a volatile, explosive mixture of alpha and omega, of need and possession. Kalen crossed the room, his steps slow, deliberate, each one a final, irrevocable step away from his old life. He knelt before Elian, his shadow falling over the boy's trembling form. "They are coming to kill you." Kalen's voice was a low, guttural rasp, stripped of all its former precision. It was the voice of the beast. Elian could only look at him, his mind reeling, his body a battlefield of pleasure and pain. He could not form words. He could only feel. He felt the terror of the purge team. He felt the agony of the heat, and he felt the overwhelming, terrifying, and desperately wanted presence of the Alpha kneeling before him. "I will not let them," Kalen vowed. And in that moment, he was no longer Commander Kalen, First Knight of the Sovereign Guard. He was just Kalen, and he was committing treason. The world had shrunk to the four walls of the scriptorium. Outside, the Crown's authority was absolute. The purge team would be assembling, their cold, efficient lethality preparing to breach the lockdown. But inside, there was only the heat, the scent, and the man who had just sacrificed everything. Kalian moved with a strange, hypnotic grace, the predator finally unleashed. He shed his formal black tunic, the garment of his office, of his servitude, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded skin. The act was symbolic, a severing of his past. Underneath, he wore a simple grey undershirt that did nothing to hide the coiled strength of his body. The scriptorium, once a place of sterile order, had become a primal sanctuary, a den. Elian watched him, his mind a fever dream of instinct and fear. The heat was a fire in his blood, demanding a release he did not understand. His body arched on the floor, an involuntary supplication. He was losing himself, his carefully constructed identity as Scribe 734 dissolving in the furnace of his biology. He was only Omega now, a creature of scent and need, and the only solid thing in his swirling, chaotic universe was the Alpha before him. Kalen came to him, not with the violence Elian might have expected, but with a reverence that was far more shocking. He gathered Elian from the floor, his touch gentle but firm, and carried him to the small alcove where a maintenance cot was stored for curators during long diagnostic sessions. He laid Elian down on the thin mattress, the synthetic fabric cool against his fevered skin. The air was so thick with their combined scents it was almost liquid, a heady, intoxicating atmosphere that made the head swim. "Elian," Kalen said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had used the name. It sounded like a prayer or a curse. He placed a hand on Elian's forehead, his palm cool and grounding. "This is your heat. Your body thinks it is in danger. It thinks it needs to create a life to survive." Elian whimpered, the sound small and lost. I don't know what to do." The confession was a whisper of pure terror. Kalen's gaze was intense, the storm grey of his eyes swirling with a conflict that mirrored Elian's own. He was fighting his instincts, the part of him that wanted to simply take, to claim, to dominate. But there was something else in his eyes too, a deep, aching tenderness that had no place in the world they had known. "I know," he said, his thumb stroking Elian's temple. The simple, gentle touch was an anchor in the storm. The inhibitors. They were not meant to fail like this. They were meant to erase this part of you completely. The system failed you. He leaned closer, his scent a comforting, possessive blanket. He nuzzled against the scent gland on Elian's neck, a gesture so instinctual, so intimate, it sent a tremor of pure, unadulterated pleasure through Elian's entire body. Kalen was scent-marking him, claiming him, shielding him from the world with his own potent identity. The Alpha's scent began to calm the frantic terror of the Omegas, a biological balm. "They will be at the door soon," Kalen murmured against his skin, his breath hot. "They will try to breach it, but the lockdown will hold for a time. We have a little time." Time for what? Elian's mind was too clouded to ask. He only knew that the ache inside him was growing, a hollow emptiness that demanded to be filled. His hands came up, his fingers tangling in Kalen's short, dark hair, pulling him closer. It wasn't a conscious act. It was his body, speaking a language his mind had never learned. Kalen looked into his eyes, a silent question passing between them. He was not the system's enforcer anymore. He was giving Elian a choice, even now, when instinct was screaming at them both to dispense with such civilities. He was offering a consent that the crown had never once afforded either of them. And in that moment, Elian understood. This was not just about survival. It was about defiance. To give in to this instinct, this heat, with this man, was the ultimate act of treason against the system that had tried to render them both into sterile, functional parts. It was an affirmation of the very humanity, the very biology they had been denied. It was a reclamation. He answered not with words, but by tilting his head back, baring the pale, vulnerable column of his throat. An offering, an acceptance, an invitation. A shudder went through Kalen's powerful frame. It was the last thread of his control snapping. With a low groan that was equal parts pain and release, he lowered his head. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry, claiming. It tasted of salt and fear and a profound, shared loneliness. It was the taste of rebellion. The night, or what passed for it in the timeless, artificially lit scriptorium, was a fever. It was a blur of tangled limbs and slick skin, of whispered words that were not names or titles but raw, elemental sounds. It was pain and pleasure, a tearing down of walls both physical and emotional. Kalen was not a gentle lover, but he was not cruel. He was focused, present, his every action a response to the silent, desperate cues of Elian's body. He was showing Elian a truth his archives had never contained, the truth of connection, of instinct, of the fierce, beautiful chaos the crown so feared. For one night, in a sealed room at the heart of the empire, the first knight and the priceless scribe committed the ultimate heresy. They were not Alpha and Omega. They were not commander and asset. They were just Kalen and Ilian. And in their shared treason, they found a kind of freedom that was more real, more vital than anything they had ever known. As the heat finally crested, a shattering, world-altering release. A thought, clear and sharp, pierced through the haze of Elian's mind. He was not a broken machine. He was not a defective asset. He was alive. The afterglow was a fragile, temporary peace. The heat had broken, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a profound sense of clarity. Elian lay tangled in Kalen's arms on the narrow cot, the scriptorium silent around them. The air, no longer a battlefield of frantic scents, had settled into a new equilibrium. A complex, layered aroma of their mingled chemistries, of sated alpha and claimed omega. It was the scent of a bond forged in defiance, a bond that marked them both as traitors. Kalen was awake, his gaze fixed on the seamless white ceiling. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight over Elian's chest, his body a warm, solid shield. The fierce, primal alpha of the heat had receded, but the stoic, disciplined commander had not returned in his place. The man holding him was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of the last few hours. "They will have tried the overrides by now," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Elian's body. "The door is forged to withstand a direct plasma charge for 12 minutes. They will be cutting through it." The reality of their situation crashed down on Ilian, a chilling counterpoint to the warmth of Kalen's embrace. The purge team, the sanitization. Their time was running out. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to take hold, but the new, steady presence of the alpha beside him kept it at bay. "What do we do?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kalen turned his head, his storm-grey eyes meeting Elian's. The coldness was gone from them, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. "I have served the crown my entire life," he said, his voice flat with a self-directed irony. "I know its weaknesses. I know its blind spots. I designed half of the security protocols in this citadel, and I designed them with back doors. For me." He sat up, his movements fluid and purposeful. He was no longer the conflicted man caught between duty and instinct. He was a soldier with a new mission. He began to dress, pulling on the grey undershirt, forgoing the black tunic of his old life. He was stripping himself down to the essential. "There is a maintenance conduit that runs beneath the scriptorium floor," he explained, his voice crisp and efficient. "It connects to the primary waste reclamation system. It's shielded from all internal sensors. They will expect me to fight my way out through the corridors. They will not expect me to go down into the guts of this place." He moved to the data slate, his fingers flying across its surface, not transcribing, but commanding. He pulled up schematics, rerouted power, and created a series of cascading system failures in other sectors of the citadel. Ghosts in the machine to distract the security grid. He was a master artist, turning the crown's own instruments of control against it. Elian watched him, a sense of awe mixing with his fear. This was the true Commander Kalen, not just the rigid soldier, but a brilliant, calculating strategist. He had chosen his side, and he was bringing the full weight of his formidable talent to their cause. Elian slid off the cot, his body aching, but his mind sharp. He found his uniform, the simple white tunic and trousers of a scribe, and pulled them on. The clothes felt wrong now, the costume of a person he no longer was. Kalen finished his work at the slate and turned to a section of the wall that looked identical to every other panel. He pressed a sequence of points on its surface, and with a low hiss, the panel slid aside to reveal a dark, narrow opening. A rush of cool, damp air, smelling of treated water and machinery, flowed into the scriptorium. It was the first unfiltered air Elian had ever smelled, and it was a revelation. "It will be tight and dark," Kalen said, turning to face him. He reached out, his hand cupping Elian's cheek. His touch was proprietary, gentle. "Stay close to me. Do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" Elian nodded, his throat too tight for words. He looked into Kalen's eyes and saw his own reflection. He was not Scribe 734 anymore. He was not a fragile asset. He was a fugitive, a co-conspirator, Kalen's partner in treason. A loud, percussive bang echoed from the blast door, followed by the high-pitched whine of a plasma cutter. Their time was up. Now, Kalen commanded. He swung himself into the conduit, then reached back for Elian, his grip strong and sure on Elian's arm, guiding him into the darkness. As Elian lowered himself into the cramped tunnel, he took one last look at the scriptorium. The white room, his entire world for 22 years, looked small and pathetic, a sterile prison he was finally leaving. Kalen slid the panel shut above them, plunging them into absolute blackness. The only sounds were the clang of the purge team working on the door, their own ragged breathing, and the frantic, hopeful beating of his own heart. They were no longer commander and scribe. They were traitor and defective asset, fugitives from the only life they had ever known. Kalen took his hand, his fingers lacing through Elian's, a silent promise in the dark. And together they began to run, deeper into the bowels of the machine, searching for a way out. The guts of the citadel were a labyrinth of pipes and wires, a mechanical underworld that smelled of lubricant, ozone, and decay. It was the opposite of the clean, white world above. It was dark, dirty, and brutally functional. Kalen moved through the oppressive blackness with an unnerving confidence, one hand holding Elian's in a grip of iron, the other tracing lines of conduit on the tunnel wall, navigating by touch and memory. The only light was the faint, intermittent glow of status indicators on junction boxes, casting their faces in brief, ghostly flashes of red and green. For Elian, whose entire existence had been a sensory vacuum, it was an overwhelming assault. The textures were rough and cold under his free hand. The sounds were a cacophony of hisses, groans, and the distant rhythmic thrum of the citadel's massive heart. It was terrifying. But the firm, steady presence of Kalen beside him was an anchor. He was no longer a scribe, a creature of data and logic. He was a body, following another body through the dark, trusting in a connection that went deeper than words or reason. They moved for what felt like hours, twisting through tunnels that grew progressively smaller and filthier. Twice they had to freeze, pressing themselves into alcoves as the telltale vibration of a patrol drone passed nearby. In those moments of enforced stillness, Kalen would pull Elian close, shielding him with his own body, his breath a warm ghost against Elian's ear. They did not speak. There was no need. Every shared glance in the fleeting light, every squeeze of the hand was a conversation. Finally, they came to a place where a vertical maintenance ladder stretched up into more darkness. "This is it," Kalen whispered, his voice the first sound to break their long silence. "Waste disposal chute 12. It leads to the underlevel processing plant, near the outer wall. Security is automated, but light." The climb was arduous. The rungs were slick with grime, and Elian's muscles, unused to such exertion, screamed in protest. But Kalen was right behind him, a steadying presence, his voice a low murmur of encouragement. When they reached the top, Kalen worked on the hatch for a full minute before it groaned open, flooding the shaft with the dim, grey light of the processing plant. The plant was a vast, cavernous space filled with colossal machinery that sorted and incinerated the citadel's waste. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and chemicals. Drones zipped through the air on pre-programmed routes, their optical sensors glowing red. They moved in the shadows of the machinery, a nerve-wracking game of hide-and-seek with the unblinking eyes of the machines. They reached the far wall, a towering sheet of ferrocrete that separated the sterile perfection of the citadel from whatever lay beyond. Kalen led Elian to a massive exhaust port, its fan blades currently still. Every 12 hours, the system purges atmospheric toxins, Kalen explained, his eyes scanning the area. The purge cycle is due in 7 minutes. The fan will activate, but for the first 30 seconds, the outer vent will be open before the incinerators kick in. That's our window. It was a suicidal plan, a gamble based on a 30-second window of opportunity, but it was their only one. They waited in the shadow of a reclamation furnace, the minutes stretching into an eternity. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Kalen, whose face was calm, focused, a mask of pure determination. This man, who had been the perfect cog in the machine, was now risking everything to break it. An alarm blared, signaling the start of the purge cycle. A moment later, the massive fan in front of them began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, creating a powerful draft. "Now!" Kalen yelled over the noise. They ran. They scrambled through the fan before it reached its lethal velocity and sprinted down a short, wide tunnel toward a brilliant, blinding square of light. The outside. The world. The wind from the fan was a physical force at their backs, pushing them forward. As they burst through the opening, the world exploded into Elian's senses. The light was not the soft, sterile white of the citadel, but a brilliant, golden sun that made him cry out and shield his eyes. The air was not clean and empty, but thick with 1,000 smells, damp earth, green growing things, the distant salt tang of an ocean. The silence was not a void, but a living thing, filled with the whisper of wind and the chirping of unseen creatures. They tumbled onto soft, damp ground, rolling to a stop in a patch of tall, green grass. For a moment, they just lay there, gasping for breath, the roar of the exhaust port fading behind them as the vent slammed shut. Elian opened his eyes, blinking against the sun. Above him was a sky of the most impossible, brilliant blue, streaked with clouds like wisps of white silk. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He sat up, looking around. They were on a cliff overlooking a vast, churning ocean. The citadel was a monolithic, windowless spire of grey behind them, an ugly scar on the vibrant, living landscape. It looked alien, dead. Kalen was watching him, his expression unreadable. He had a long, bleeding gash on his arm from a piece of machinery, but he seemed not to notice. He was looking at Elian's face, at the wonder and shock written there. They were stripped of everything, their titles, their homes, their purpose. They were fugitives, alone in a world they didn't understand. He was a scribe with nothing to record. Kalen was a knight with nothing to guard. Nothing but him. Elian reached out, his fingers gently tracing the edge of Kalen's jaw. The man who had been a terrifying force of nature, an avatar of the system, now looked lost, vulnerable. He leaned into Elian's touch, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. It was a surrender, a confession. "I served the crown," Kalen said, his voice quiet, raw. "I believed in order, in purity, in the logic of the system." He opened his eyes, and the storm in them was one of profound, soul-shattering revelation. It was a cage. I just never saw the bars. In that moment, standing on the edge of a world reborn, Elian understood that their rebellion was not just about escape. It was about liberation, not just for him, the prisoner, but for Kalen, the guard. The system had imprisoned them both, just in different ways. He leaned in, and his lips met Kaelin's. This kiss was nothing like the desperate, fevered claiming in the scriptorium. It was slow, tender. It was a promise. It was the first sentence of a new chapter, written not on a data slate, but in the clean, wild air of a world that was finally, truly theirs. Their new life began with the taste of salt and the feeling of damp earth beneath their fingers. The world outside the citadel was a relentless tide of sensation that left Elian in a state of near constant wonder and exhaustion. Every day brought a new discovery. The texture of tree bark, the shocking cold of a stream, the complex bitterness of an edible root Kaelin identified from his survival training. For so long, Elian's reality had been curated, filtered, and served to him in sterile, bite-sized pieces. Now, he was feasting on the raw, chaotic banquet of existence, and it was overwhelming, terrifying, and more beautiful than any data stream he had ever transcribed. Kaelin became his guide, his anchor in this bewildering new world. The skills that had made him the crown's perfect weapon were now turned to the simple, profound task of survival. He could read the weather in the clouds, track animals by their faintest traces, and find shelter in the lee of a rock formation. He moved through the wilderness with a quiet competence that was breathtaking to watch. But Elian saw the change in him too. The rigid posture of the commander was gone, replaced by a more relaxed, watchful grace. The harsh lines of his face softened when he looked at Elian, or when he simply stood on a ridge, watching the sun set over the ocean. The beast was not caged anymore, but it was not rampant either. It had found a balance, a peace that the citadel had never offered. They traveled for days, following the coastline, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the grey spire of their former prison. They spoke little, but their silence was a comfortable, shared language. At night, they would huddle together for warmth, wrapped in a discarded thermal blanket Kaelin had salvaged from a crashed patrol drone. In the dark, with the sound of the waves as their only companion, they would talk. Elian spoke of the archives, of the ghost histories he had uncovered. Kaelin spoke of his training, of the relentless conditioning that had shaped him, of the small, buried doubts he had never dared to voice. They were piecing together their own histories, finding the people they were beneath the roles they had been assigned. One evening, they found a secluded cove, a crescent of black sand sheltered by towering cliffs. A waterfall cascaded down one side, feeding a clear, deep pool. It was a place of impossible beauty, a secret sanctuary. As Kaelin worked on setting up a simple camp, Elian, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand, stripped off his worn, grimy scribe uniform and waded into the pool. The water was shockingly cold, but it felt clean, cleansing. He submerged himself, letting the water wash away the last vestiges of the citadel. The warm feel of recycled air and sterile surfaces. When he surfaced, gasping, Kaelin was standing at the edge of the pool, watching him. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of gold and purple. Kaelin's face was unreadable in the twilight, but his eyes held a profound intensity. Without a word, he shed his own clothes and joined Elian in the water. They came together in the center of the pool, the cool water swirling around them. Kaelin reached out, his hands tracing the faint lines on Elian's back where the diagnostic probes of the curators had so often been attached. His touch was a question, a memory, an apology. "They treated you like a thing," Kaelin said, his voice a low, pained whisper. "A fragile instrument. I was one of them. I saw you as an asset to be protected." "You were," Elian replied, his own hands coming up to rest on Kaelin's broad, scarred shoulders. "But you were the one who saw the person inside. You were the one who broke the glass. The water magnified every sensation, the slide of skin on skin, the gentle lapping of the waves against their bodies, the steady, powerful beat of Kaelin's heart against his palm. The bond between them, forged in the fire of the heat, was a living, breathing thing. It was no longer just instinct. It was a deep, quiet understanding, an emotional resonance that transcended the labels of Alpha and Omega. Kaelin pulled him closer, his forehead resting against Elian's. "I don't know what comes next," he confessed, the admission a stark display of vulnerability from a man who had always been the embodiment of certainty. "I only know how to fight for the crown. I don't know how to live for myself." "Then we'll learn," Elian said, his voice soft but sure. "Together." He looked past Kaelin, toward the horizon where the last sliver of sun was sinking into the sea, setting the water on fire. The future was a vast, unknown territory. The crown would hunt them. They were two fugitives against an empire. The odds were impossible. But for the first time in his life, Elian was not afraid. He was no longer a scribe, recording the past. He was a creator, writing a new future, one word, one touch, one day at a time. Their journey eventually led them inland, away from the coast and into the dense, ancient forests that the crown had labeled as untamable wilderness. It was here, Kaelin reasoned, that they would be safest. The Citadel's drones and patrols were less effective beneath the thick canopy. It was also here that they found the first signs of other people. A carefully tended patch of herbs, a snare trap cleverly hidden, a series of markings carved into tree trunks. They were not alone. They followed the signs cautiously, Kaelin's instincts on high alert. Finally, they came upon it, a small, hidden settlement, nestled in a valley, a collection of rustic buildings built into the trees and hillsides, so perfectly integrated with the landscape that they were nearly invisible. Smoke curled from a chimney, carrying the scent of burning wood and roasting meat. It was the scent of a home. Their arrival was met with suspicion. People emerged from the dwellings, their faces wary, their hands holding simple, effective weapons. They were a motley group, men and women of all ages, their clothes a patchwork of salvaged materials and homespun fabrics. An older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair stepped forward, a leader. "You are a long way from the grey spire," she said, her voice steady. She looked at Kaelin, her eyes lingering on his military posture and the faint, faded outline of the insignia on his collar where he had torn it off. "And you smell of it, of steel and discipline." Then her gaze shifted to Elian, and her expression softened with a flicker of recognition. "And you smell of rain and old books, and of him." Kaelin stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Elian. A protective gesture, but no longer the rigid stance of a guard. It was the posture of a partner. "We mean no harm," he said. "We are refugees." The word felt strange on his tongue. It was a term from the archives, one used for the displaced and the broken. But it was what they were. The woman, whose name they learned was Mara, listened to their story. Kaelin, ever the strategist, gave her the tactical version. A security officer and a high-value asset who had uncovered a corruption within the system and were forced to flee. He omitted the raw, personal details of the heat, the bond, the treason born of love. But Mara seemed to understand the words he wasn't saying. She looked from Kalen's fierce, protective gaze to Elian's quiet strength, and she nodded slowly. "We are all runaways here," she said. "We are the unregistered, the defective, the ones who did not fit in the Crown's perfect machine. You are welcome to stay, but you must work. You must contribute. We all have a part to play." And so, their new life began again. Kalen, the former First Knight, used his skills to train the settlement's small defense force, teaching them tactics to evade and counter the Crown's patrols. He was a natural leader, but his leadership was different now. It was born of respect, not rank. Elian, the former scribe, found his own purpose. He had spent his life as a vessel for information, and he discovered that his memory, his ability to organize and recall vast amounts of data, was invaluable. He helped Mara organize their supplies, plan their crop rotations, and most importantly, he began to record their stories. He created a new archive, not on a luminous data slate, but on scraped and treated animal hides using ink made from berries and charcoal. He was recording the history of the forgotten, the defiant, the free. They built a small life for themselves, a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, a routine that was not dictated by protocol, but by the rising of the sun and the needs of their Oi community. In the quiet moments, they found a profound, simple joy they had never known, the joy of a shared meal, the comfort of falling asleep in each other's arms, the freedom to simply be. One evening, Elian was sitting outside their cabin, writing, when Kalen returned from a patrol. He sat down beside Elian, laying a small, vibrant blue wildflower in his lap. Elian looked up, and his breath caught. The last rays of the sun were filtering through the trees, and the light caught in Kalen's eyes, turning the storm grey to a soft, warm silver. The mask was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, unguarded love that was more powerful than any weapon, more absolute than any ideology. "I used to believe my purpose was to serve," Kalen said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against Elian's. "To die for an idea, for the crown, for order." He looked around at the small, thriving community, at the green world that surrounded them, and then his gaze returned to Elian, to the center of his new universe. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "My purpose is not to serve an idea. It is to serve a life, this life, with you." He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian. And Kalen, the man who once served only the crown, now served only him. Not as a guard serves a charge, but as a heart serves a body. It was his new creed, his new truth. And in the quiet of their shared freedom, it was more than enough. The story of their treason was over. The story of their life was just beginning.